There's a sentence that gets repeated so often in conversations about generational wealth that it started to function less like an observation and more like a wall. You either have it or you don't. It shows up whenever someone tries to describe the particular composure of a family that's been wealthy for 100 years. The unhurried way they make decisions. The way they seem allergic to showing off. The way money seems to sit on them rather than radiate off them. And the conclusion people reach almost every time is that this is a birthright, something absorbed through osmosis in a nursery on Park Avenue or a manor in the Cotswolds, not learned, not learnable. That conclusion is wrong, and it's wrong in a specific, provable way. Old money isn't a personality. It's a curriculum, a set of behaviors around time, money, attention, and relationships that get drilled into children the way other households drill in table manners, repeated so early and so often that by adulthood they don't feel like rules anymore. They feel like instinct, which means they're not genetic, they're procedural, and procedures can be reverse engineered. Over the next 40 minutes, we're going to take apart 10 specific, observable traits, behaviors, not aesthetics, that show up consistently across old money families, from the Rockefellers to the Wallenbergs, to families you've never heard of because they've spent a century making sure you wouldn't. We're going to look at where each trait comes from, why it works mechanically, not mystically, and critically, how an ordinary person starting from zero can actually build it into their own life. No trust fund required, because the myth that this is inherited does something quietly damaging. It lets people off the hook. If you believe composure and financial patience are things you're either born with or not, you never try to build them. It becomes a comfortable explanation for staying exactly where you are. Someone else got the upbringing, the connections, the early exposure, so there's nothing to be done. That story is emotionally convenient and mechanically false, and this video exists to take it apart piece by piece. A quick note on method before we start, because it matters for everything that follows. Every trait in this video is drawn from documented behavioral patterns, family governance literature, and established research in sociology and behavioral finance, not lifestyle guesswork or aesthetic mimicry. Buying the right coat or learning the right fork doesn't make you old money, and this channel has never claimed otherwise. What we're after here is underneath the aesthetics entirely, the actual cognitive and behavioral wiring that produces the aesthetics as a byproduct, not the goal. Get the wiring right, and the rest tends to follow on its own. Get the aesthetics right without the wiring, and you've built a costume. Let's get into it. The time horizon traits. Trait 1, radical delayed gratification. The single most load-bearing trait in old money psychology isn't a financial technique. It's a relationship to time. In 1970, Stanford psychologist Walter Mischel ran what became known as the marshmallow experiment. Children were offered 1 marshmallow immediately, or 2 if they could wait roughly 15 minutes alone in a room with the first marshmallow sitting in front of them. Decades of follow-up work linked the children who waited to a range of better long-term outcomes. Though it's worth flagging clearly here that later, larger replications complicated the original findings significantly, showing that household economic stability explained a large part of the effect. A child who has learned that resources are unreliable has a rational reason not to wait. Delay only makes sense when the future feels dependable. That caveat is actually the whole story. Old money families don't produce patient children through willpower training. They produce patient children by manufacturing radical, multi-generational future certainty. When a family has a 150-year-old trust structure, a family office that's operated continuously since your great-grandfather's era, and grandparents who talk about the family's plans for 2075, the way other families talk about next weekend, waiting stops requiring discipline. It becomes the obvious move because the future is not an abstraction. It's a scheduled appointment. The applied version of this trait, independent of trust funds, is what behavioral economists call temporal reframing. It's the practice of evaluating financial decisions not by their immediate emotional payoff, but by modeling their outcome at a fixed future date, 10 years, 20 years, before acting. Old money households do this instinctively at the dinner table. It's a habit of narration, not net worth. Before a purchase, someone in the family asks aloud, "What does this look like in a decade?" How to build it? You don't need a dynasty to install this mechanism. You need a forcing function. Financial planners increasingly use a simple tool for this, writing a one-paragraph letter to your future self dated 10 years out, describing the financial outcome of a decision you're about to make before you make it. The externalization matters. A thought stays abstract. A written letter with a date on it starts to feel like a promise you'd be breaking. There's a second, quieter mechanism worth naming here, because it's the one old money households actually rely on more than willpower, pre-commitment through structure rather than through discipline in the moment. A trust with a distribution schedule doesn't require an heir to resist temptation. The money simply isn't accessible yet, regardless of how they feel on a given afternoon. That's not a character trait. It's an environmental design choice. The applied equivalent for anyone is removing the decision from the moment of temptation entirely. Automatic transfers to a separate, harder-to-access account the day income arrives, before it ever sits in a checking account where it can be spent on impulse. Old money doesn't out-discipline impulse. It out-engineers it. It's also worth being precise about what this trait is not. It is not indiscriminate frugality, and it is not an aversion to spending. Old money households can and do spend significantly on education, on health, on experiences with long compounding value. What's absent is reactive spending, purchases made because an emotion needs resolving right now. The time horizon isn't a leash on spending in general. It's a filter on which spending counts as rational. Trait 2. Multi-generational thinking as default frame. Related but distinct, old money doesn't just delay gratification within a lifetime. It delays it across lifetimes. Decisions get evaluated not by, will this benefit me, but will this still be standing for someone who hasn't been born yet? This is documented explicitly in family governance literature. The Fugger family of 16th century Augsburg, arguably the wealthiest family in European history at their peak, built governance documents that explicitly bound the behavior of family members not yet conceived. The Rothschild family's 19th century partnership agreements did the same. This isn't sentimentality. It's a risk management technology. A family that plans in centuries makes systematically different decisions than one that plans in fiscal quarters, because a 100-year horizon makes short-term volatility statistically irrelevant while making structural compounding decisions, land, education, reputation, enormously valuable. How to build it? The applied version for an individual is a personal or family constitution, a short written document, revisited annually, stating what you're optimizing for beyond this year. What you want to still be true about your finances, your relationships, your reputation in 20 years. Family governance researchers who study multi-generational wealth consistently point to written intention, however informal, as the mechanism that outlasts any specific financial tactic. The Wallenberg family of Sweden offers a particularly clean illustration of this trait in action, because their governance model is unusually well documented for a family this size and this durable. Since the late 19th century, the family has operated on a principle sometimes summarized internally as esse non videre, to be rather than to be seen, paired with a governance structure that deliberately routes control of the family's industrial holdings through a foundation rather than direct individual inheritance. Precisely so that no single generation's short-term preferences can dismantle what took generations to build. The mechanism isn't sentimental attachment to tradition. It's structural. Individual impulse is architecturally prevented from overriding multi-generational intent. For an individual without a foundation or a trust structure, the honest translation of this trait is smaller but still real. Treating your own financial decisions as though a future version of your family, a child, a grandchild, even just a future version of yourself, has a vote in the room. It sounds abstract until you apply it to something concrete, like a home purchase evaluated not just for what you can afford now, but for whether it's a foundation someone could actually inherit, maintain, and build on. If the idea that old money is a set of installable habits rather than a birthright is new to you, that reframe is the whole premise of this channel. We've spent the last several months mapping the actual mechanisms, legal, psychological, and financial, behind generational wealth, and none of it is roped off. Subscribe if you want the rest of the map. The money literacy traits. Trait 3, financial literacy as a first language. Here's a distinction that matters more than it sounds like it should. Most people learn about money as adults, in a crisis, under stress. Their first real financial education is a bounce check, a credit card statement, a mortgage application. Old money children learn about money the way other children learn a second language, early, repeatedly, in low-stakes settings, before it's emotionally loaded. This shows up concretely in old money households as small, boring rituals. A child given a modest allowance not as a gift, but paired with a ledger they're expected to reconcile. Being present, even silently, for family discussions about the household budget or a philanthropic gift structure. Being asked, from a young age, to explain why a purchase makes sense before making it. The content is unremarkable. The consistency and the early start are what make it different. By the time these children face a real financial decision, a first job offer, a first lease, the vocabulary is already fluent. There's no fear response to overcome because money was never treated as an emotionally dangerous subject to begin with. How to build it. For an adult starting late, the fix is the same mechanism run backward, deliberately, repeatedly exposing yourself to financial literacy in low-stakes settings until the emotional charge wears off. Concretely, read one primary source financial document a month you'd normally avoid, an actual fund prospectus, a real mortgage amortization schedule, your own full brokerage statement instead of just the balance, and narrate it out loud or in writing, the way you'd explain it to a 12-year-old. The goal isn't mastery, it's desensitization. Fluency comes from repetition without stakes, not from one dramatic study session. there's a second layer to this trait that's easy to miss. Old money households don't just teach financial mechanics, they teach financial vocabulary early enough that terms like liquidity, amortization, basis point, and diversification stop sounding like a foreign language by the time they matter. Vocabulary gaps are one of the most underrated barriers to financial confidence. It's difficult to ask a good question about something you don't have the words for, and silence gets misread as disinterest or lack of aptitude when it's frequently just unfamiliarity with the terms. Keeping a running personal glossary, writing down and defining in your own words every financial term you encounter and don't fully understand closes that gap faster than almost any other single habit because it turns passive confusion into an active, trackable list. It's also worth naming what this trait explicitly is not. It isn't about becoming a stock picker or a day trader. Old money financial literacy is oriented almost entirely toward comprehension and stewardship. Understanding what you own, why you own it, and what the mechanics of a given instrument actually do, rather than toward active speculation. Fluency, not activity, is the goal. Trait 4, calibrated risk, insured against catastrophe, not gambling for upside. A common misconception is that old money is risk-averse. It isn't. Old money families are frequently aggressive investors, early-stage venture positions, illiquid private equity, concentrated land holdings. What they're allergic to isn't risk, it's ruin. There's a useful distinction from risk theory here. A risk is a bet you can survive losing. Ruin is a bet that, if lost, removes you from the game entirely. Old money portfolios are structured often through family office diversification and generation-skipping trust layers, so that no single decision, however aggressive, can produce ruin. The aggressive bet happens inside a fireproof room. This produces a very specific psychological trait: comfort with volatility, discomfort with irreversibility. An old money heir might genuinely not flinch at a portfolio dropping 20% in a downturn, because the horizon is decades and the floor is protected, while being nearly phobic about anything with no downside limit. Unlimited personal liability, an uninsured position, a legal exposure with no cap. How to build it. The applied version doesn't require a family office. It requires separating your financial life into a ruin-proof layer and a risk layer, explicitly. Emergency reserves, insurance, and any debt that could compound out of control belong in the first layer and get handled conservatively, non-negotiably, before anything else. Everything else, a bet on a business idea, a concentrated stock position, a career pivot with a pay cut, can be genuinely aggressive because the first layer means it can't destroy you. The trait isn't caution, it's compartmentalization. The insurance instinct specifically deserves a moment because it's one of the more counterintuitive markers of old money thinking to an outside observer. Families with substantial assets are frequently disproportionately well insured, not lightly insured, as you might expect from people who could theoretically absorb a loss out of pocket, but heavily and specifically insured, often against risks with a low probability, but a catastrophic, unbounded downside, liability exposure, long-tail legal risk, key person risk in a family business. The logic is precise. A family that can absorb a loss financially still won't accept an unbounded one, because unbounded risk is the one category of risk that can't be modeled or planned around at all. Every other kind of risk can at least be sized. This one can't, so it gets transferred rather than carried. The individual translation is straightforward and, frankly, underused. Adequate liability coverage, umbrella insurance once you have anything worth protecting, and a hard personal rule against ever taking on debt with no defined ceiling, variable rate instruments with no cap, personal guarantees with no limit, anything where the worst case is technically infinite. The specific dollar amounts scale with your situation, but the rule doesn't. Bound every risk you take, even the aggressive ones. The consumption traits, trait 5. Quality density over quantity. Thorstein Veblen coined conspicuous consumption in 1899 to describe spending designed to signal status through visible excess. Old money culture, somewhat counterintuitively, is built partly in opposition to Veblen's model. Not because old families reject spending, but because their signaling operates on a different axis entirely, durability and craftsmanship rather than visibility. The trait shows up as a consistent purchasing pattern: fewer items, higher per-unit quality, extremely long replacement cycles. A single well-made overcoat worn for 15 years, rather than 5 fast fashion coats worn for 1 season each. Furniture bought with the explicit expectation that a grandchild will inherit it. This isn't primarily an aesthetic preference, it's arithmetic. A garment or object priced 10 times higher but lasting 30 times longer is, on a cost-per-year basis, cheaper, even before accounting for resale and repairability. Old money households do this math instinctively because they were taught to evaluate purchases on lifetime cost rather than sticker price. How to build it. The applicable discipline here is a simple filter, applied consistently. Before a non-trivial purchase, calculate cost per use or cost per year rather than sticker price, and default toward the option with the longer realistic lifespan, even at a higher upfront cost. It requires resisting the psychological pull of a lower number today, which is precisely the muscle this trait is built to train. This same logic, scaled up, is the entire justification behind the category of assets old money households return to again and again. Farmland, fine art held for decades rather than flipped, water rights, well-maintained real estate. These aren't glamorous holdings, and they're rarely the subject of exciting dinner conversation, which is itself part of the point. What they share is a durability profile. They don't wear out, go out of fashion, or require replacement, and many actively appreciate simply by existing and being maintained. The consumer goods version of this, buying one excellent tool instead of 5 mediocre ones, is the exact same instinct applied at a household scale rather than a portfolio scale. A practical add-on worth naming, this trait also shows up as an unusually high tolerance for repair over replacement. Old money households routinely have a standing relationship with a cobbler, a tailor, a furniture restorer, professions that, in a culture oriented around disposability, can feel almost archaic. But the arithmetic holds. Repairing a well-made object is nearly always cheaper over its full lifespan than repeatedly replacing a poorly made one. Building a relationship with even 1 or 2 repair professionals, rather than defaulting to replacement the first time something breaks, is a small, immediately actionable version of this entire trait. Trait 6, discretion as discipline, not modesty. This is frequently misread as humility. It isn't humility, it's risk management applied to social visibility. Old money households treat visible wealth as a liability with 3 distinct costs. It invites litigation and predatory attention. It distorts relationships. You can no longer tell who values you versus your money. and it undermines negotiating position in nearly every transaction, from real estate to hiring. The behavioral pattern is specific and learnable. Logos removed or absent, price never discussed in front of outsiders, homes and vehicles chosen for quality and visible at a glance, rather than obvious at a glance, and a conversational habit of redirecting any question about cost or net worth within seconds. None of this requires wealth to practice. It's a communication discipline that can be built starting today in any income bracket. And it compounds because people who don't know your financial position treat you more honestly. How to build it? A concrete starting exercise. For 30 days, decline to volunteer the price of anything you own or purchase, even when directly asked, using a neutral redirect. It does the job / I got a good deal on it, rather than a number. This single habit, sustained, retrains the reflex that most people have never questioned, the urge to justify a purchase's value by stating its cost. It's worth being precise about the boundary of this trait, because it's easy to misapply. Discretion, done well, is not secrecy toward people who have a legitimate need to know. A spouse, a financial advisor, a business partner. It's the elimination of unnecessary disclosure to people who have no functional need for the information and who would only use it to recalibrate how they treat you. Old money households distinguish sharply between these two categories, and conflating them is the most common way people misapply the trait, becoming evasive with people who deserve transparency while remaining appropriately private with everyone else. There's also a negotiation dimension to this trait that rarely gets discussed. In almost any transaction, buying a home, negotiating a salary, structuring a business deal, the party with less visible financial pressure has structural leverage, because the other side can't calibrate their offer around your perceived urgency or ceiling. A person who visibly needs a deal to go through and says so has already given away information that will be used against them at the negotiating table. Discretion, in this frame, isn't a lifestyle aesthetic. It's a quantifiable negotiating advantage that costs nothing to practice, and that most people surrender for free in casual conversation without ever realizing they've done it. Quick question while we're in the consumption section. Which of these two traits do you find harder to actually practice? Buying less and better, or staying quiet about what things cost? Drop it in the comments below. I read all of them, and it genuinely shapes which traits we go deeper on in future videos. The relationship traits, trait 7, network cultivation as maintenance, not transaction. Sociologist Mark Granovetter's 1973 concept of the strength of weak ties found something counterintuitive. People are far more likely to get valuable opportunities, jobs, introductions, capital, through loose acquaintances than through close friends, because close friends tend to know the same people and information you already know, while weak ties bridge into entirely different social clusters. Old money networks are functionally enormous, deliberately maintained webs of weak ties, built through boarding schools, private clubs, alumni associations, and multi-generational philanthropic boards, and the trait that makes them functional isn't charisma, it's maintenance discipline. Contact is kept warm through small, low-effort, non-transactional touches over years. A note after a family event, attendance at something with no immediate personal benefit, a follow-up on someone else's project with no ask attached. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu described this accumulated web of relationships as social capital an asset class as real and as compoundable as financial capital, just invisible on a balance sheet. The critical distinction from ordinary networking is timing. Value is never extracted near the moment it's created. A relationship cultivated for a decade before any request is made behaves completely differently than one where the ask arrives in the first conversation. It reads as durable rather than opportunistic, which is mechanically why it works. How to build it: maintain a simple private list, even a spreadsheet, of 20 to 30 relationships you want to be genuinely durable over a decade, and commit to one small, no-ask touchpoint with someone on that list every week. The habit, not the cleverness, is the entire mechanism. The institutional version of this trait is worth understanding, even if you'll never access the institutions themselves, because the underlying logic transfers. Boarding schools, elite universities, and private clubs function sociologically less as educational or recreational institutions, and more as extremely efficient weak-tie generation machines. They compress decades of chance encounters into a few concentrated years, producing a dense network of loose acquaintances who will statistically end up scattered across a wide range of industries and institutions over the following decades. You don't need the institution to replicate the mechanism. Any environment with sustained, repeated, low-stakes contact over years, a professional association, a recurring volunteer commitment, even a consistent hobby group with some overlap into professional life, can function the same way, just more slowly and with more deliberate effort required on your part to substitute for what the institution would otherwise provide automatically. One more distinction matters here. Old money networking culture places heavy emphasis on introductions being earned through reputation rather than requested directly. Being introduced by a mutual trusted contact carries dramatically more weight and creates dramatically more goodwill than a cold approach, because the introducer's own reputation is implicitly staked on the quality of the connection. Practically, this means the highest leverage networking behavior available to almost anyone isn't asking for introductions. It's becoming the kind of contact other people are comfortable vouching for, which loops directly back to the maintenance discipline described above. Trait 8. Stewardship mindset over ownership mindset. This is one of the more subtle traits and one of the most psychologically load-bearing. Family governance researchers studying multi-generational wealth consistently identify a mental model shift as the single strongest predictor of whether a family avoids the well-known shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves pattern. Wealth built in one generation, maintained in the second, dissolved by the third. Families that survive past the third generation tend to raise heirs who describe themselves as stewards of an asset rather than owners of it. The practical difference: an owner asks, "What can I extract from this for myself?" A steward asks, "What condition will I hand this to the next person in?" That single reframing changes almost every downstream decision. Spending, risk tolerance, disclosure, even how conflict gets resolved within a family, because a steward's ego is not attached to unilateral control in the way an owner's is. How to build it. This trait transfers cleanly outside family wealth entirely into a career, a small business, even a shared living space. The exercise: for any significant asset or responsibility in your life, explicitly ask, before a decision, am I optimizing this for what I can take from it right now, or for the condition I want it in when someone else inherits or takes over responsibility for it? The question alone tends to change the answer. The Japanese merchant dynasty concept of i.e. the household as a continuing institution that individual family members serve and pass through, rather than a possession any single member owns outright, is one of the clearest historical articulations of this trait anywhere in the world, and it's part of why family businesses in Japan have some of the longest average lifespans on record globally. The individual is, in a real structural sense, secondary to the institution's continuity. That's an extreme version of the principle, and it's not being suggested as a template to copy wholesale. Most people don't want to subordinate their individual identity to a multi-generational institution, and that's a reasonable position. But the underlying mechanism, dialed down to a personal scale, is what's transferable, treating your career, your reputation, even your home, as something you're temporarily responsible for improving rather than something that exists purely for your own consumption, tends to produce measurably better long-term outcomes than the ownership frame does, because it changes the time horizon of every decision made about that asset. Stewardship thinking also changes how conflict gets handled, which is worth naming because it's one of the more practically useful side effects. An owner in a dispute is defending personal territory. A steward in a dispute is defending an institution's long-term interest, which is a less personally threatening frame, and, not coincidentally, tends to produce calmer, less escalatory conflict resolution. Families that survive multiple generations without fracturing disproportionately describe their disagreements in stewardship language rather than ownership language, even in the heat of the disagreement itself. The composure traits. Trait 9, tolerance for boredom, intolerance for novelty. Chasing old money investment philosophy, most visibly documented in the endowment model pioneered by Yale's David Swenson, is built on a trait that looks almost anti-modern: deliberate, sustained boredom. Long holding periods. Illiquid positions held for a decade or more without checking daily performance. A near total absence of the impulse to chase whatever asset class is currently generating headlines. This isn't laziness. Behavioral finance research has repeatedly documented that investors who check portfolios more frequently make more emotionally reactive decisions and, on average, achieve lower returns than those who check rarely, a phenomenon sometimes called myopic loss aversion, where frequent monitoring of volatile assets amplifies the emotional sting of short-term losses and provokes premature selling. Old money households structurally limit their own exposure to this bias, not through superior willpower, but by simply looking less often and holding longer by design. How to build it. A concrete evidence-backed practice. For long-term holdings, deliberately schedule review at fixed, infrequent intervals, quarterly at most, rather than checking in response to news or emotion. Some financial advisors go further and recommend clients remove portfolio apps from their phone entirely. The trait being trained here is specific: tolerance for not knowing in the short term in exchange for better outcomes in the long term. This trait extends well beyond investment portfolios, and this is where it gets most interesting as a general life pattern. Old money culture has a well-documented general suspicion of novelty for its own sake. New social trends, new asset classes, new consumer categories are treated with default skepticism rather than default enthusiasm, and adoption tends to lag well behind the mainstream, if it happens at all. This isn't technophobia or reflexive conservatism. It's a simple base rate observation, absorbed early: most novel things, investment vehicles, consumer products, social trends, underperform or fade relative to their initial hype and the honest, unglamorous strategy of waiting for a track record to establish itself before committing attention or capital has a demonstrably better long-term success rate than being first. The psychological cost of this discipline is real and worth naming honestly, because glossing over it would undersell how hard it actually is. It means tolerating a specific recurring discomfort, watching other people get excited about something you've chosen not to chase, and sometimes watching them succeed with it without your own conviction wavering. Old money households manage this discomfort largely through the time horizon and stewardship framing discussed earlier in this video. If your success is measured in decades rather than in comparison to this quarter's most exciting story, missing one trend costs you comparatively little, and the discipline of consistently not chasing compounds into a real, if unglamorous, advantage over time. Trait 10. Rigorous command of soft skills. The last trait is the least discussed and arguably the most immediately transferable. Old money education places heavy, explicit weight on skills that mainstream education treats as optional: formal negotiation, public speaking, written correspondence, and etiquette understood correctly not as decoration, but as a communication protocol that reduces friction and signals trustworthiness at every social threshold. Interviews, boardrooms, negotiations, first meetings with in-laws. Pierre Bourdieu's framework of cultural capital is directly relevant here. Fluency in these unwritten codes functions as currency, opening doors that have nothing written on them requiring a fee. What's important for this video's purpose is that cultural capital, unlike financial capital, is entirely learnable at any age and any income level. It requires exposure and deliberate practice, not inheritance. How to build it? Pick one soft skill per quarter and treat it with the same rigor you'd apply to a technical skill, a negotiation class, a Toastmasters chapter for public speaking, a formal etiquette or protocol course, or simply structured practice writing physical correspondence rather than only digital messages. The old money advantage here isn't mysterious. It's hours logged, starting earlier and more deliberately than most people ever choose to. It's worth being direct about why this specific trait tends to generate the most skepticism when this topic comes up, because the skepticism is understandable. Etiquette, in particular, gets dismissed, often fairly, as arbitrary gatekeeping dressed up as manners, a set of rules whose only real function is to identify insiders and exclude outsiders. That critique isn't wrong historically. Bourdieu's own analysis of cultural capital treats etiquette and taste explicitly as class signaling mechanisms rather than as neutral good practice, and this channel has covered that gatekeeping function directly in past videos. But there's a second function running alongside the exclusionary one, and it's the function actually worth building: a shared low-friction protocol for high-stakes social situations, reduces cognitive load and default social anxiety at exactly the moments, negotiations, first meetings, formal gatherings, where composure matters most for the outcome. Someone who has never had to think consciously about which fork to use, how to make a formal introduction, or how to write a proper letter of thanks, has more working memory available in the actual moment for the substance of the interaction, the negotiation itself, the pitch itself, the relationship itself, rather than for managing their own visible discomfort. That's the trait worth extracting from etiquette training, independent of its historical use as a class filter. Not the specific rules, but the underlying comfort that comes from having automated the social mechanics, so your attention is free for what actually matters in the room. If the endowment model, or the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves pattern, is unfamiliar, we've covered both in full-length breakdowns already on this channel. Links are in the description and pinned comment. This video works as a standalone, but the library builds on itself, and longtime viewers will recognize a few callbacks throughout. Why these traits compound together, not separately. None of these 10 traits function especially well in isolation, and that's worth stating plainly before we close. Delayed gratification without financial literacy just produces someone who waits and then makes an uninformed decision anyway. Discretion without a stewardship mindset can curdle into secrecy for its own sake. Network cultivation without genuine patience reads as transparently opportunistic and undermines itself. What makes old money households effective isn't any single trait maximized. It's all 10 operating as a reinforcing system, each one lowering the friction cost of the others. Financial literacy makes delayed gratification easier because the future outcome is legible rather than abstract. A stewardship mindset makes discretion feel natural rather than performative, because there's no ego investment in being seen as wealthy. Comfort with boredom makes long-term network cultivation sustainable because you're not anxious for a payoff. This is mechanically why the born with it theory persists. A person raised inside all 10 traits simultaneously, from early childhood, genuinely does look qualitatively different from someone attempting to bolt one trait onto an otherwise unchanged financial and psychological life. But the difference is dosage and integration, not category. Every trait on this list has been demonstrated above to be practicable by an adult starting from 0, with no inherited structure at all. Out of all 10, if you had to build only one this year, which would move the needle most for your actual life right now, not which sounds best, but which would you genuinely act on? I'd rather know that than the popular answer. Tell me in the comments, and if you want a deeper breakdown on any single trait from this list. Stewardship mindset and the shirt sleeves curse have come up a lot in past comment sections. Say so, because we build the next scripts directly from these threads. A 30-day starting framework. To close, a practical sequencing note, because 10 traits at once is not a plan, it's a wish list. The most common failure mode when people try to adopt this kind of framework wholesale is attempting all 10 simultaneously and abandoning all 10 within a month. A more realistic sequence, drawn directly from the How to Build It sections above. Weeks 1 and 2. Install the discretion habit and the cost per year purchasing filter. Both are behavioral, require no financial commitment, and produce fast, noticeable feedback. Weeks 3 and 4. Begin the financial literacy repetition. One real document a month, narrated in plain language. And set your portfolio or savings review to a fixed, infrequent schedule rather than an emotional one. Month 2. Start the relationship maintenance list and commit to the weekly no-ask touchpoint. This is the trait with the longest payoff horizon, which is exactly why it needs to start early rather than last. Month 3 onward. Layer in the stewardship reframe for one significant asset or responsibility, and pick your first soft skill focus for the quarter. None of this requires capital. It requires sequencing and repetition, which, if there's a single thesis underneath everything in this video, is the actual mechanism behind generational wealth that the phrase old money tends to obscure. It was never really about the money first. It was about a set of habits around time, attention, and restraint that happen to make money durable as a side effect. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. If you want the next piece of this framework, we're planning a deep, full-length breakdown specifically on building a family constitution from scratch, even as an individual with no dynasty yet to govern. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch it. And if this video gave you at least one trait worth actually starting this week, that's the entire goal of this channel. See you in the next one.